What's up, dwarves and dragon riders? So, you think you know Eragon? The Inheritance series was a huge hit a while back, spawning video games, toys, clothing, posters, and no movie! There was never an Eragon movie! It didn't happen! Also, spoiler warning for Eragon and the Inheritance series as a whole. So as much as people have theorized about the series, like what the Manoa tree took from Eragon, or what happened to Oramis' sword after he dropped it, or why Eragon didn't just use the true name of the ancient language to cleanse Rowengard like he did with Galbatorix's castle, and then set up the new dragon riders there instead of leaving Alagasia altogether like a dummy, there's one thing I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. The backstory. And the fact that it's, you know, kind of impossible? And yeah, I know, there's magic and all that, but I'm about to show you that even with all the magic and fantasy shenanigans in the world, there is simply no way Galbatorix could ever have defeated the Dragon Riders, because the Riders had a power on their side that's greater than any magic: math. First, a quick refresher on how Galbatorix came to power. The Dragon Riders were founded in the year 5305. In year 7877, a young human named Galbatorix joined the Riders. In 7886, Galbatorix's dragon was killed. He demanded a new one, but the Riders refused. He then killed two young riders, fled, 3 years passed, and Galbatorix met a young rider named Morzan. The two of them stole a dragon hatchling and forcibly bound it to Galbatorix as its new rider. Then, in 7896, Galbatorix and Morzan declared war on the Riders, and over the course of just 4 years, Galbatorix, Morzan, and 12 other riders who joined their side over the course of the war managed to defeat every single dragon rider, and every single tame dragon, and every single wild dragon in the world by the year 7900. Now, that seems bananas on the surface, but it gets way worse when you really dig into it. But wait, I hear you saying, Galbatorix won because he captured all the Eldunari and forced them to do his bidding. Well, dear viewer, yes, but actually no. First, Galbatorix didn't actually managed to subdue the Eldunari until after the end of the war. But Galbatorix knew the true name of the ancient language, so he could control all magic. Again, yes, but actually no. He didn't find the true name until right near the very end of the entire series, more than a century after he had defeated the Riders. So without those two advantages, Galbatorix would have had no chance. But we're just getting started. As I said earlier, the Riders were founded in 5305 and were defeated by 7900. That is 2,595 years. We're told in the books that wild dragons would give a few eggs to the Riders each year, so assuming 3 eggs per year times 2,595 years, that's 7,785 eggs. We know that almost all of them eventually bonded with a rider and hatched, because when Eragon finds the Vault of Souls, which contains all the remaining dragon eggs in the world, there were 217 wild eggs and just 26 eggs which were meant for riders. Counting the 3 eggs that Galbatorix had, that means that roughly 99.627% of all the eggs given to the riders eventually hatched, or 7,755. Let's round that down to 7,700 to keep the math simple and give Galbatorix a better chance. Now, not all the dragons would still be alive when Galbatorix started his war. The Riders were founded nearly 2,600 years ago, so some amount of dragons and riders would have died in the meantime. While both are immortal and don't age, they can still be killed by disease or fatal injury. However, given that all riders were powerful magicians, experts in combat, and could heal with magic, and that the dragons were, well, dragons, a rider or dragon dying was very uncommon. Realistically, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to say that 90% or more of all the riders and dragons in the Order would still be alive when Galbatorix attacked. That's just under 7,000 riders and 7,000 dragons that Galbatorix would have to defeat, with just 13 henchmen. On top of 7,000 riders and 7,000 tame dragons, there were also many tens of thousands of wild dragons that fought against Galbatorix. We know the wild dragons only gave a few eggs per year to the riders, and it's not like they're going to give more eggs to the riders than they keep for themselves, so there would be at least dozens of wild dragons being born each year. If we assume just 1 dozen, that's still over 31,000 wild dragons born just since the Riders started. If we assume a 10% mortality rate like we did for the Riders, that leaves 28,026 wild dragons alive at the start of the war. And I know you may be thinking that wild dragons would have a higher mortality rate than the Riders' dragons because wild animals tend to live shorter lives than domesticated ones, but even wild dragons are immortal, and the Riders' dragons were constantly riding into battle, whereas the wild dragons just kind of chilled out in the wilderness, so I figure them being wild and them not not constantly going into battle kind of cancel each other out. Anyway, that's 28,000 wild dragons. Of course, there were also wild dragons born before the Riders were founded, but their numbers were reduced extremely low during the war between the elves and the dragons that led up to the founding of the Riders. So there may have been as few as several hundred dragons left when the Riders were founded. So, Galbatorix and his 13 magical college dropout henchmen would have to defeat 28,000 wild dragons, plus 6,900 tame dragons, and 6,900 riders, almost all of whom were more powerful and more skilled than them. Oh, and also tens of thousands of non-rider elves, all of whom were powerful magicians in their own right, plus tens of thousands of dwarves, plus hundreds of thousands of humans. And as if the sheer numbers weren't enough, the riders also have an insurmountable advantage in age. See, dragon riders, being immortal, just kind of stopped aging after a certain point, but kept getting stronger. Maybe they get a bit wrinklier after a few centuries, their hair a bit grayer, but their bodies stayed just as strong as they were in their prime, and their magic only got more powerful. And dragons, well, dragons never stopped growing. Ormus says that some of the more ancient dragons could have been mistaken for mountains, and since the amount of magic you can wield directly correlates to the amount of energy in your body, a larger body means more energy, which means more magic. A single 2,000-year-old dragon would have more energy in one scale than Galbatorix's dragon would have in its entire body. Remember, Galbatorix was only 29 when he attacked the riders. Almost every single rider in the order would be older than that. Going by our rate of 3 new riders per year and taking into account the fact that new riders joined the order at age 10, that would mean there would only be a maximum of 57 riders who were younger and thus weaker than Galbatorix, while over 6,800 would be older and thus stronger than him or any of the Forsworn. Some of the riders would be well over 2,000 years old, so their power would absolutely dwarf that of Galbatorix and the Forsworn. And a single 2,000-plus-year-old dragon would be large enough that it could literally just eat the Forsworn and their dragons in one bite. There's also the fact that, being so young, none of the Forsworn or Galbatorix himself had actually completed their training, meaning there were entire aspects of magic that they didn't know existed. For example, Aragorn learns to draw energy to use magic from other living things, such as plants, animals, or even other people. And we're told Galbatorix doesn't know how to do this because he left the Riders before he finished his training. We also have to consider the factor that magical energy storage would play. Energy can be stored inside gemstones, and most Riders made a habit of storing any extra energy they had in case they ever needed it in an emergency. Since many Riders were thousands of years old, many of them would have millennia worth of energy stored up. Galbatorix only learned magic 19 years ago, so he'd have at most a few years worth of magic stored up, if any. No matter how clever or skilled he isn't going to be able to so much as touch his opponents if their wards are powered by 2 millennia worth of magic. Another little tidbit that often gets forgotten is the fact that the dragons of all 13 of the Forsworn have their names magically stripped from them as punishment for betraying their race. That means given names, true names, nicknames, family names, everything. As a result, their minds deteriorated and they lost the ability to think, eventually becoming nothing but mindless animals, in contrast to the exceedingly intelligent minds of normal dragons. And while a giant fire-breathing lizard is a great weapon whether it can think or not, 13 mindless dragons against tens of thousands of intelligent ones is just no contest at all. And there's more still. See, when two magicians battle, they engage in a telepathic struggle where each tries to invade the mind of the other and disable them from within, preventing their opponent from using magic. Only after one has conquered the mind of the other do they actually cast any spells. If they didn't do this, it would be mutually assured destruction. Sure, you could fire off a spell to kill your opponent without invading their mind first, but in the split second before it hit, they'd fire one back at you and you'd both be dead. So unless one magician is willing to commit a suicide attack, both magicians hold off on using spells until one of them has mentally dominated the other. But the thing is, if it became clear that the riders were going to lose, most of the riders would be willing to sacrifice themselves to take Galbatorix out. So realistically, the riders could have just sent out a magician who was willing to die for the cause, or a dozen of them just to be safe, who would fire off killing spells at Galbatorix without engaging in mental battle first. And yeah, those spellcasters would be killed in return, but Galbatorix would still be dead. You have to imagine, given the gravity of what was at stake here, there would be more than a few riders willing to do this. And in fact, we know of at least one rider who actually did sacrifice himself. Thuviel was a rider whose dragon had been killed earlier in the war. Mad with grief over his loss, he used a spell that converted all the matter in his body into pure energy. For those that don't know, that's what nuclear fission is. Fission as in the process that nuclear bombs use. Thuviel literally converted himself into a freaking nuke that exploded in Galbatorix's face at nearly point-blank range. And we're told Galbatorix survived because he shielded himself. Just come on, Paolini. I know you were young when you wrote this, and it is a really cool set piece, but just, he shielded himself? Really? That's your excuse? Even by your own rules, that doesn't work. We're told very early on in the series that doing something by magic takes the same amount of energy from your body as it would take to do by hand. So for example, lifting a big rock with magic requires as much energy as lifting it by hand, and magically shielding yourself from an attack requires as much energy from your body as deflecting that attack by hand. For sword strikes or arrows, that isn't a big deal. But a nuke? Shielding yourself from a nuke? By definition, that would require more energy from your body than is released in a nuclear explosion. Spoiler alert, that is not possible, even with magic. E equals mc squared tells us that energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. And friendly reminder, the speed of light is big, like 299,792,458 meters per second big. If we assume that Thuvil only weighed a svelte 150 pounds, converting the mass of his body to energy would equate to the release of 6,155,794,222,752 megajoules of energy. That's roughly equivalent to 1.471 gigatons of TNT. For comparison, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II had a yield of approximately 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. A gigaton is equivalent to 1 million kilotons. That means the explosive yield from Thuvil nuking himself would be over 98,000 times greater than the yield of bombs that completely obliterated entire cities. And we're expected to believe that Galbatorix somehow had more energy in his body than that. Come on, Paolini. I mean, come on! Funnily enough, it actually was possible for Aragorn to shield himself when Galbatorix turned himself into a nuke, because by then, Aragorn knew the true name of the ancient language, so he had control over all magic. Galbatorix did not know the true name when he got nuked. So whether it's the fact that the riders, tame dragons, and wild dragons outnumbered Galbatorix nearly 3,000 to 1, the fact that many of the dragons would be big enough to eat Galbatorix and his henchmen and their dragons in a single bite, or the fact that we've mathematically proven there is no way Galbatorix could have survived a magical nuke to the face, no matter how you look at it, the backstory of how Galbatorix came to power just doesn't hold up. I can't be too hard on Paolini though. He was only 16 when he started writing the story, so it's understandable that he didn't really think through every detail all the way. But when you look at everything all together like this, yeah, ain't no way Galbatorix was ever gonna win that war. Luckily, it's just the backstory, and the story itself doesn't have any loose ends at all, right? 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 Well, it's a fun series anyways. Hey, thanks for watching. If you found this kind of analysis interesting, check out one of my previous videos, and maybe subscribe and hit the bell to catch my next one. Anyway, this has been So You Think You Know, and now you do know.